I've been asked to speak about young and education in this little introductory talk. By far the greater part of Young's educational efforts were in fact focused on the village school at Otterbourne. There's a picture of it on the slide. The school had been founded by her parents in the 1830s under the auspices of the National Society for Promoting the Education of the Poor in the principles of the established Church of England and Wales. And throughout her adult life, she went almost every morning when she was at home to take the girls for their religious education. She also took a major part in the school's administration, overseeing the Otterbourne School's adaptation to the nation's various changes in educational policy through government grants, government inspection, and what she saw as the threat of non-denominational board schools. She wrote textbooks with an Anglican slant for the National Society's depository to suit these changes, and she depicted education in these schools in the Langley School stories that she wrote in the 1840s and again in the 1880s. On the other hand, I'm aware that this is not the Charlotte Yonge that most of the people listening to this talk are so fond of. The education you are likely to be interested in is the education of the young girls who appear in the blue-bound books of the Macmillan Uniform Edition, the education of the Mohans, the Mays, the Underwoods, and the Merrifields, who appear in books published from 1847 to 1900, the sort of girls for whom Yonge was editing the monthly packet. I've therefore decided to focus my talk on upper middle class, that is, young ladies' education, on the sort of education that Yonge saw as appropriate for girls who expected to live at home, supported by their fathers, until they married and were then supported by their husbands. I want to look at what things Yonge saw as proper in her earlier novels, and then to chart her response to the changes being advocated by the emerging women's movement, public examinations, high schools, universities, and so on. I'm afraid I'll be assuming that this audience is familiar with the characters in most of the main novels, and that I will not need to give little plot summaries each time a character's name or a book title is mentioned. This may make some listeners feel they have been dumped into a world where they know no one and everyone else knows everyone else. But I hope the narrative I'm attempting to provide of how one intelligent woman described the education of girls of her own class and how she viewed the changes over 60 years will emerge from the mass of detail. It's clear that throughout her writing life, Yonge believed that the ideal education for girls of her own class, the future young ladies, was that conducted at home by a governess under the superintendence of the mother of the family. Her books suggest that the classic schoolroom routine changed very little over her lifetime. Whether the mother and governess were dealing with only one girl or a schoolroom with half a dozen children ranging from rowdy little boys of 9 or 10 to serious-minded girls of 16, it is clear that each child had its own individual program. The standard method of teaching, particularly of the younger children, seems to have involved the children learning their lessons from some sort of textbook and then having them heard by the mother or governess. This is Yonge's account from Magnum Bonum. The next interruption was from the children, each armed with a pile of open books on the top of a slate. Carey, that's their mother, went outside the window with them, sitting down under a tree, whence the murmured sounds of repetition could be heard, lasting about 20 minutes between the two. And then she returned, the little ones jumping on each side of her. Young seems to have been taught in this way 50 years earlier. When she was about 6, her mother noted that since the 2nd of August, C has done 1,016 lessons, 537 very well, 442 well, 37 badly. Don't you think that's lovely, this poor little girl? Her mother's noting down the 1,000 lessons. This must have involved careful organisation by mother and governess. Young gives a picture of the ideal in her account in The Two Sides of the Shield of how Lady Merrifield conducted her schoolroom in 1884. Maisie was sent off to her music in the drawing room, whither her mother followed with Primrose's little lessons, leaving the schoolroom piano to Valletta and Fergus to write copies and do sums, while Miss Vincent, that's the governess, examined the newcomer, which she did by giving her some questions to answer in writing and some French and German to translate and parse, also in writing. This, however, was Young's ideal, and written when families of this kind were increasingly sending their children to local day schools. In 1853, when she wrote The Daisy Chain, she was more concerned with the difficulties the system created for clever, studious girls, and gave a graphic account of how trying it was for a girl with Ethel May's interests and aspirations. The visiting French teacher, an émigré, can't explain the grammatical logic behind idiomatic French. She has to work at her advanced mathematics against a background of her little sister repeating her easy lessons to the governess, while her other sister, Mary, flounders piteously over the difficulties of compound long division. She is then pulled away from her maths to answer questions of this kind. What is the date of the invention of paper? What is the latitude and longitude of Otaheite? And then is set to work on her sewing and forced to listen to Mary at her reading lesson, murdering the quarrel between Brutus and Cassius. Young acknowledged that the home-based education had its problems, especially when it came to the teaching of accomplishments, that girls living in country towns and villages did not have access to high-quality masters in either languages or the arts. Nevertheless, she strongly resisted the solution many parents found of sending their daughters to boarding schools of the ladies' seminary type, where the girls were taught by visiting masters. In the more prestigious and expensive of these schools, the masters were often well-known professional artists and musicians, using this as a way of building up their incomes. But Young did not believe these opportunities outweighed what she regarded as the threat to maidenliness of boarding schools. She wrote in Womankind in 1874, "It is not possible to have large numbers of young girls boarding together without injury to qualities more essential than intellect. It is a curious thing, but of universal experience, that while most boys are improved by the intercourse with their own kind in large numbers, generally the larger the better, girls certainly deteriorate in proportion as the sense of family life is lost." She had by this time, that is 1874, given a number of examples of how boarding schools could strip girls of the simplicity and innocence which was fostered in good homes. In Dinevor Terrace, James Frost's young sister is made miserable by petty vanities, small disputes, fretful jealousies, insincere tricks, and sentimental secrets current among her fellow pupils. At the Miss Pearsons in Pillars of the House, a snobbish senior girl tricks a young undermistress into opening her box of prized possessions and then begins rifling through the box, laughing over the little treasures and jewels and asking who gave them to her and what they cost. In The Two Sides of the Shield, Constance Hackett, who persuades Dolores into deceiving her aunt, describes with gusto the underhand ways in which the girls at the even more vulgar school she had recently left tricked their teachers and tried to make contact with young men in the neighbourhood. Of course, quite a number of the women in Young's books do receive their education in these unpropitious circumstances. The future sister Constance and her two sisters in The Castle Builders were sent from India when Kate is little more than a toddler. Carrie Brownlow from Magnum Bonham is at the School for Officers' Orphans, and Robina and Angela at the High Church School run by Miss Fenimore and Bertha Fulmort. For the first decade and a half of her writing life, Young could assume that her sympathy with the intellectual aspirations of clever girls like Lilias Moen and Ethel May placed her in the vanguard of the reformers of girls' education. In the late 1860s, however, the women's movement appeared on the scene and things began to change. The women's movement had various groups within it, mostly organised into societies with specific aims. Changes to the married women's property laws and the divorce laws, opening wider opportunities for the girls crowding into teaching and dressmaking. This was the strand that inspired Rachel in The Clever Woman of the Family. The opening of medicine to women, the vote. Young's novels show she was aware of this movement. In two of her novels, The Clever Woman of the Family and The Three Brides, the protagonists are influenced by the literature published in one case by the Society for Promoting the Employment of Women, the SPEW, and in the other case, the Ladies' Sanitary Association, the LSA. Actually, these two societies, although they had almost no members in common, rented adjacent offices on and off from 1859 into the 1900s, first of all at Langham Place and then in Berners Street. The SPEW pops up again in Magnum Bonham, where we are told that the eldest Ray sister earned her living as a law copier, and this was an occupation pioneered for women by the SPEW in 1860. However, the campaign that had most impact on middle-class girls' education, and the one that we can most easily trace through Young's novels, sprang from a different concern: the widespread dissatisfaction with young ladyhood that was experienced by so many of the young women who appeared in and read Young's novels. One such young woman wrote in her diary in 1851, "What I remonstrate against is the negative forms of employment, the wasting of energy, the crippling of talent under false ideas of station, propriety and refinement that seem to shut off a large portion of women of our generation from proper spheres of work and adequate exercise of powers." Young, who had a full and successful professional life herself, was sympathetic to these complaints. In her very first novel, the young heroine exclaims, "Here am I in Abbey Church and must make the best of it. I must be as polite and hypocritical as I can make myself. I must waste my time and endure dullness." The major solution that Young offered to those without literary or artistic talents was service to the church, and in the daisy chain she shows how Ethel, her archetypal clever young woman, finds her life's work in bringing religion to the brickmakers' families in an isolated hamlet. It seems to me that what worried Young most about the women's movement initiatives was their independence, the fact that they were not integrated into the Church of England's social mission. As I hope I'll show, Young never rejected proposals simply because they were women's movement proposals. She judged them by the educational principles she had already developed, by the effect she thought they would have, and by their congruence with what Bessie Parks, one of the founders of the women's movement and herself a Roman Catholic, called her loyal devotion to her convictions in regard to the Anglican Church. In The Pillars of the House, Geraldine's symbolic cartoon, based on Raphael's School of Athens, illustrates these convictions. Women working everyone for her own hand is all know-how, either grim or silly, the laughingstock of gods and men, while working for the church makes all harmonious and sets each in her place. This dissatisfaction with young ladyhood was the impetus behind the campaign led by Emily Davies, the women's movement member who had the first and greatest impact on the education of the young women Young wrote about. Emily Davies was the daughter of a clergyman in Gateshead. She had grown up in a clever, argumentative family and, unlike Young, had come to the conclusion, though she was circumspect about expressing her view, that there were no real intellectual differences between men and women. She believed that the answer to these complaints about dullness and calls for something to do lay in giving women the same opportunities as their brothers, in opening the standard upper-middle-class careers of physician, barrister, upper division civil servant, and, for those with independent means, politician, to women. But to achieve this, women must be admitted to university education, and to fit them for university education, they must pursue the same secondary curriculum as boys. Her campaign began in 1862, when she and her recently widowed mother moved to London, and she began almost immediately introducing the question of university education into the various forums where women's movement members discussed their ideas and projects. Her first proposal was that young women should demonstrate their fitness for university education by sitting for one of what were called the local examinations, local because they were held at centres throughout the country, that had recently been set up by the major universities to test the quality of teaching in the endowed boys' grammar schools. They weren't university entrance exams, they were just to look at the teaching. It soon became apparent that none of the official boards would consider the project. Emily Davies then devised a tactic she was to use again in gaining university education for women. The London local committee of the Cambridge board was persuaded to give the girls informal access to papers and have them privately marked by the official examiners. She hurriedly gathered together a group of girls from schools known to be offering a strong academic education, and these girls sat the examinations in 1863. No difficulties arose, and by 1865, girls were officially accepted as candidates, not just for the Cambridge locals, but for the exams held by Oxford, Durham, and Edinburgh universities as well. From the beginning, Young approved the Cambridge locals. When a correspondent wrote, apparently expecting her to condemn the examinations, she replied, "I'm quite inclined to believe the Cambridge examination to be a very good thing. I should have been very glad of them to work for when I was young enough. I hope it may occupy the clever young ladies." 10 years later, in Womankind, she gave this advice to girls who had left the schoolroom but wanted to continue their studies. "Perhaps the best way is to go up for the Cambridge examinations. As these are conducted in writing and as they are not competitive, they do not seem to me to involve anything unfeminine or undesirable." She endorsed them again in 1878 in a short comic book, The Disturbing Element, about a group of girls living in an isolated rocky seaside town who decide they will help one another to study for the Cambridge locals. The disturbing element is the men that pop up in their lives. Indeed, Young saw these examinations as serving a purpose not much considered by Emily Davies. They provided, she believed, a qualification for governesses. She wrote in Womankind, "There is at present much more power than used to exist of gauging the capacities of teachers for young ladies as well as for the poor. No professional teacher now in 1876 under 5 and 20 ought to be engaged for girls over 14 who cannot produce a certificate from a university." She endorsed this for her general readers in Pillars of the House, where Robina at the High Church School in Brompton is described as preparing herself for the Cambridge examination, her great subject of ambition, on which her whole start in life might depend. Robina's dedication is rewarded, and we see her a few years later established as the second governess at a generous salary with the aristocratic Delacour family. Emily Davies saw the Cambridge locals as leading in a rather different direction. Her next move was to establish a residential women's college in Cambridge, where women studied for the same examinations as the men. And in early 1868, she wrote round to all the women, including Young, whom she regarded as in some way being public intellectuals, and asked them for their support. Young's response was totally negative, yet it was not any objection to women straying into male territory or undertaking unsuitable studies that seemed to have bothered her, but the objection she had developed many years ago to boarding schools. She wrote to Emily Davies, "I have decided objections to bringing large masses of girls together and think that home education, under the inspection or encouragement of sensible fathers, or voluntarily continued by the girls themselves, is far more valuable both intellectually and morally than any external education." She continued to maintain this stance for at least the next 10 years, and her disapproval increased, I would suggest, by noticing the ladies' colleges had not established close links with the Anglican hierarchy. This was the basis of her refusal to support the warden of Keble College and his wife in the founding of Lady Margaret Hall. She wrote, "I do not think any scheme succeeds that has not a decided religious object, and in my mind the real difficulty is that this plan seems to be lectures plus church." It was not until 1890 that any of the clever young ladies in her fiction are shown as even thinking of enrolling in a woman's college, And even then, it is the self-important but misguided Arthurine Arthurette from the short story Come to Kingdom, who has ambitions to go to Girton, which she seems to have abandoned once she inherits a country estate. Young was far more tolerant of the next women's movement proposal, the creation of the high school. In 1874, Young, still driven by her dislike of boarding schools, wrote in Womankind, "Would it not be possible to establish good day schools conducted by really superior women to whom the girls in each town might resort from their homes, establishing in combination with them small boarding houses under ladies of such qualifications as would make real motherly homes of their houses?" It's hard to believe that Young was not influenced here by a scheme recently initiated by three aristocratic supporters of Emily Davies: Maria Gray, Emily Sheriff, her sister, and Lady Stanley of Alderley, a scheme which resulted in the founding of the Girls' Public Day Schools Company in 1872. The company's aim was to open a series of proprietary schools for girls based on the model of Francis Buss's North London Collegiate School. I think what had happened here was that Miss Buss, who ran what had begun as a simple family school, had developed a way of teaching quite large numbers of girls at roughly the same standard, together in classes. A method partly based on practices developed in the elementary schools and partly on the tradition of lectures by experts followed by essays that had been pioneered at Queen's College in the 1850s. Thus it moved quite a long way away from the individualised methods used by governesses and which had also been customary in the small private schools. Girls at the same level could be grouped together and expected to do the same exercises, answer the same questions in class, write essays on the same topics, and be marked according to a common standard. This meant that the school could increase its numbers without having to increase the number of staff or losing the quality of the education. And it was not just its organisation that the new high schools took over from the North London Collegiate School. The Girls' Public Day School Company also chose to follow this school in ignoring the status line between the upper middle class and the lower middle class, between professional men's and tradesmen's daughters. Perhaps the founders' aristocratic backgrounds made them regard such distinctions, so significant to those like Young's characters who lived in daily awareness of them, as trivial. And the GPDS innovations went even further. Their schools were to be non-denominational. Lady Stanley wrote that it was decided from the beginning that in their schools all distinctions of class or sect should be absolutely ignored. It was largely predicted, she went on, that this latter condition would bring ruin for the undertaking. Nevertheless, the high schools flourished. By the end of the century, the company had opened 38 schools, though there had been some closures and mergers, and other organisations founded schools on the GPDSC model. High schools began appearing in Young's books in the early 1880s. That is almost 10 years after the first high schools were founded. This is probably because by this time, the kind of families Young wrote about were increasingly making use of them. But perhaps it was also because in 1883, the Church Schools Company had been founded to create Anglican girls' schools on the GPDS model. And one of the earliest schools was Winchester High School, founded by Anna Bramston, a friend of Young's. This would seem to explain why, when in the 1880s, Young created the second generation of Mohans and Merrifields, living in and around the seaside town of Rockstone, she placed a high school in the town. This gave her an opportunity to comment on what she approved and disapproved of in this new educational development. She makes it clear that the mixture of classes was for her, as for many observers, a significant feature. When Valletta is told that she is to go to the high school while her sister Maisie will stay with the Marquis's family, she protests, "I hate school and I hate Rockstone, and I don't see why Maisie should always go everywhere and wear new frocks, and I go to the butchers and bakers and wear horrid old ones." Young had from the beginning believed that this problem could be circumvented by watchful parents. Back in 1874, she had ended her proposal for day schools with the comment, "Different grades in social rank might probably meet at the school, but as it would be only in class, could hardly lead to inconvenient intercourse." And then she writes of the high school at Rockstone. The various classes of students did not see much of each other. Even those in the same form were only together in school, as the dressing room of those who dined there was separate from that of the others, and they did not come in and out at the same time. She did, however, note one of its consequences. In the long vacation, Dolores Mohan, the spokeswoman here of the egalitarian younger generation, comments, "In point of fact, the upper tradesmen's daughters come off with greater honours in the high school than do the young gentlewomen." In these 4 books, Young takes the opportunity to comment on high school practices. She seems to feel that the emphasis on examinations puts unnecessary stress on the girls. Examinations were the great autumn excitement. Gillian was going up for the higher Cambridge, and Valletta's form was under preparation for competition for a prize in languages. As the preparations became more absorbing, brows were puckered and looks were anxious, and the arts were doubtful as to the effect upon the girls' minds or bodies. She also implies that competition for prizes leads the girls in Valletta's class into an incident that is interpreted as cheating and that certainly involves bullying. Interestingly, in 1882, Young had included a story about a similar problem with girls in a village school in her collection, Langley Little Ones. Her other major criticism seems to have been that examinations narrowed the girls' interests to studying only what would tell in an examination. Lilias Merrifield, thinking back on the intellectual pleasures of her own youth, says, "History was delightful to me for the search of true knights. I had lists of them, drawings if possible. Whereas to the modern girls, either history is only a lesson, or they know a great deal too much and will prove to you that the Cid was a ruffian and the Black Prince not much better." Young lived right through the 1890s, the decade of the New Woman and the vote being granted to women in New Zealand and then South Australia. She therefore witnessed significant changes in the way the clever young ladies of her class expected to occupy their time. As Emily Davies had hoped, girls were now entering public life, not just, as in Young's earlier novels, as teachers and charity workers, but as doctors, journalists and civil servants, and as elected members of school boards and local councils. And this change is reflected in Young's novels. Her response was increasingly positive. Her opposition to women at universities was moderated as she watched the development in Oxford of Lady Margaret Hall and St Hugh's under women known personally to her. She wrote to a correspondent in 1899, that Elizabeth Wordsworth and Anne Moberly do make their colleges in many respects training for the church. By 1894, in her novels, Gillian Merrifield's father has yielded to her ardent desire of going to a ladies' college, and by 1900, in modern broods, quite a flock of girls are headed for colleges, though only to specifically Anglican ones. As Dolores says, their elders think one must learn atheism and all sorts of things at the others. Young also approves when Dolores Moen uses her education to build a career giving public lectures on scientific subjects. 20 years earlier, in The Three Brides, Mrs. Duncombe had damned herself in the eyes of her author by daring to address a mixed audience in her own person instead of asking some man to speak for her. Now Young is accepting some of the new definitions of maidenliness and considers speaking in public an appropriate use of Dolores's talents, just as running a school is for Bertha Fulmort, publishing novels for Elizabeth Merrifield, or exhibiting at the Royal Academy for Geraldine Underwood. I think that what lies behind this change is what June Sturrock calls Young's providential religious views. I am woefully ignorant about what this term means in theology, but what I think it meant to Young was that so much of what happens in the world, from personal events like the accident that prevents Margaret May's marriage to major changes in government and society, are planned or at least foreseen by God and must be accepted as his will. This, it seems to me, is how Young had come to view the changes in the lives of upper middle class women. Young seems to me to be spelling this out in the addresses given at the high school prize giving in Modern Broods. First, Arthurine Arthurette, Young's version of the New Woman, outlines the wonderful achievements of women in recent years, and she is followed by Young's high church novelist Elizabeth Merrifield, who suggests to her girl listeners that these changes, even perhaps the vote, may be planned by God, and that the education now being offered to them should be regarded in this way. She says, "Ever since a woman had been the chosen instrument of the mystery of the Incarnation, the Church, the chosen emblem of the union of humanity with her Lord, had gradually purified and exalted the sex by training them through the duties of mercy, of wifehood and motherhood, to be capable of undertaking and fulfilling higher and more extensive tasks, always by the appointment and with the help of him who had increased their outside powers for the sake of the weaker ones of his flock. What might, by his will, in the government and politics of the country, be put into their hands, no one could tell. But it was right to be prepared for it by extending their intellectual ability and knowledge of the past as well as of the laws of physical nature. All, in short, that modern education aimed at opening young minds to pursue with growing faculties." In 1928, Ray Strachey, the first historian of the English women's movement, recommended Young's books to her readers. Her delightful tales, she wrote, give pictures of the lives of educated families which are irresistibly convincing. The author was herself a convinced anti-feminist, she goes on, but her characters lived and developed with the times. I hope that the story I've outlined in this talk has to some extent shown that to label Young a convinced anti-feminist is somewhat unfair. But I hope that it has also supported Ray Strachey's claim that Young's novels provide an irresistibly convincing record of how the education of clever young ladies changed and developed during Young's lifetime.